I do want to thank our friends at CBI for sponsoring this event. And I do want to welcome you to the first in our three-part series of special legislative preview events, previewing this big political year ahead. As Kyle said before, I'm John Dankosky here at the Connecticut Mirror. Mark Pazniokas is the Capitol Bureau Chief. He is a longtime political reporter and observer, and he's got a lot to say, and there's a lot of questions that I know that you'll have in just a little bit. First, I want to start by saying the Connecticut Mirror's impact reporting is really only possible because more than 1,700 members have joined together in building this place through financial support. If you're a Connecticut Mirror member, and many of you are, thank you for the work that you do to help to create this in-depth journalism here in the state. If you're not a member, please consider joining us by making a donation through the Zoom event page. It's pretty easy to find, or by clicking on the big red button at the top of the very slick new ctmirror.org website. You can produce more impact stories and more events like this one through your support, because members really do make the Mirror. And we've had some big impact reporting just even in recent days, Mark, a project that we've been working on for some time that is helping to track some of the unclaimed property that Connecticut residents have has actually resulted in people getting some money back and resulted in some changes.
Yes, so the Treasurer's Office announced that they are going to simplify access to that. And if you want me to go into more details, you are out of luck, because you know what I've been doing all day today. I've been writing two other stories, including one that just posted about a certain U.S. Senate race. So yes, that was not the smoothest handoff in all our years of working together on audio projects we've ever experienced, but so be it.
Yeah, well, we can find out more. As a matter of fact, if you want to find out more about that, it's just really easy. Go to ctmirror.org and you can read about it today. I want to tell you also about some of the other big Zoom events we've coming up within the next week or so. This Thursday, just a few days from now at 7 p.m., it's Keith Thaneuf's big budget preview. You can bring Keith some of your budget questions. He will regale you both with his deep knowledge of the state budget and also his offbeat analogies and metaphors. I hope you can join us for that Thursday at 7 o'clock. And then next Tuesday at this time, it's a legislative preview panel looking ahead at the policy issues and the politics of this year. I'll be joined by Hearst, Connecticut's Dan Haar, CT News junkie Susan Bigelow, and Southern Connecticut State University professor Jonathan Wharton. It's an evening that I feel will be right in your wheelhouse. Tonight, ooh, Mark Pazniokas and the politics of 2022. Every year is a political year, Mark, but in an even-numbered year, with a governor's race and a race for Senate, it's especially political. Before we start at the top of the ticket here, we start with Ned Lamont and how he's faring and how you think he's going to fare in this upcoming election. Let's just talk about your unified theory of all this. Whenever we talk about the legislative priorities in a session like this in 2022, you've always told me, you know what? Yeah, there's going to be priorities, but those priorities are all going to have to do with that thing that's coming up in November. So talk a little bit about that in some of your history around that.
Certainly. Well, my history, I will acknowledge this is a bit of a milestone year for me. This will be my 40th year of covering elections in Connecticut. Wow. I'll lean in, you can see the gray hairs in the beard, but
not as many as mine.
I know.
But anyway.
I know. So no, you're right. So in the short session years, and particularly when really everything's on the table, everything will revolve around politics. We're seeing it already. The different caucuses are trying to put their stamp on different issues. The Senate Republicans, who hold only not quite a third of the seats in the Senate, they are trying to put their brand on really any number of policy initiatives, knowing they don't have the votes to drive them. So we have heard from them on crime. We have heard from them on mental health policy. Tomorrow, there's a group of Democrats who will be taking a crack at a couple issues they want to highlight. But yes, in this short session, it is all going to be geared to what happens in an August primary on the Republican side, at least for US Senate, probably not for governor, and then to November. And that will start really in earnest with the governor's budget address on Wednesday, February 9th, when the session opens. That is a political document as well as a financial document, more so in a year like this one, which is unusual. You and I have not covered years in which there was a surplus in quite a while.
Yes.
Connecticut, as Keith will remind everybody, Connecticut still has significant structural financial problems, but this year the state is swimming in the money. There is a significant surplus, and that raises its own political challenges. Sometimes they are more difficult to figure out what to do with the surplus and than it is when you're looking at how you fill a hole.
Certainly, but if part of the calculus of a political year and making political statements, documents with the budget, it seems as though the ability to hand out money to people for things certainly puts you in a far better position than the opposite position, which governors dating back 4 decades now have been in, which is, we don't have any money. How are we going to do this? How are we going to cut your taxes while we're in this deep hole?
No, you're right. And so the issue will be, and the governor tomorrow is going to give us a better idea of what tax cuts he's going to push on February 9th. But yeah, he's talked about, some private tax relief. There's been pressure to do more with the earned income tax credit. But he also is facing pressures within the Democratic coalition. You have members of the Black and Puerto Rican caucus who are not happy with what they see as the priorities so far on how to spend the American Rescue Plan money. That will be an issue in the General Assembly. The General Assembly has made clear they want to have a say in how those dollars are spent. And that's a tension between Governor Lamont and the legislature. The governor would like to move a little bit quicker on some of these things, but the legislature is going to have its say. There is pressure from progressives on the governor to adopt a more progressive tax structure. The governor does not want to do anything that would result in an income tax increase for anyone. That is a bumper sticker line. That is a talking point he does not want to hand to Bob Stefanowski over the summer and into the fall of 2022.
Well, we want to talk about Bob Stefanowski in just a little bit. Let's talk about Ned Lamont's fortunes. Before we do that, just a little bit of housekeeping here. I'm sure that you're going to want to ask Paz some questions. That's why we're doing this whole thing. You've got a whole lot of questions for him. At the bottom of your Zoom screen, there's a Q&A function. I know some of you have been putting some questions into the chat, which is excellent. And you can have a conversation as we usually do during these things with other folks who are part of this event in the chat. But if you have a question you specifically want me to put to Mark, you can just put it right in that Q&A function. I will get to as many of them throughout the course of this evening as is possible. The other quick piece of housekeeping thing is, see this little thing, Paz, that you're using as your microphone there? I think
Yes.
it's brushing up against that very nice jacket that you have. I think that was the noise that we were hearing just a little bit. This is the other thing that we didn't used to do during live radio is, some engineer would handle all of this stuff.
All right, how's this sound?
That sounds better. Yeah, I think I
right.
sounded like that. I said, like, I can hear the room. It sounds like you're at home, which you are. All right, let's dig into this. Ned Lamont, before we get to his challenger, is certainly in a stronger position than he was during the first year of his first term. Let's just say that his handling of the pandemic has had its ups and downs, but I think it's frankly fair to say that that's the case with every single governor in every state in America right now. How is Ned Lamont sitting in terms of his reelection in early February 2022?
Well, he's sitting in pretty good position in a couple of ways, and then there's some vulnerabilities in some others. So first off, if we're going to talk about how well situated he is now, we have to at least take 20 seconds to talk about what a disaster his first year in governor was. He rolled
I'm
out
sure he'd appreciate that.
he rolled out a very unpopular proposal to restore highway tolls in Connecticut as a way to stabilize funding for transportation and to make some significant improvements. But it again, it was very poorly handled. He really did not give Connecticut a sense until several months later as to what those toll revenues would buy. And by that time, it really was a bit of a political disaster, and he couldn't get his own party in the House and Senate to call a vote on something. So he abandoned that in early 2020. And then a month later, COVID arrived. And the governor very quickly showed a different side. He got to be an executive. He did not have to deal with the legislature. An important task, and one, quite frankly, that in his first year showed he was not terribly prepared to do. Like many governors, he was a regular presence on television in the early months of that. He was a reassuring voice. I think most people found. The polling certainly showed that. He went from one of the least popular governors in the United States in 2019 to one of the most highest rated when it came to job approval when we got into 2020. And he's, by and large, continued that. He has certainly suffered some scuffs and bumps along the way, as Connecticut and the rest of the country, all of us, have quite frankly suffered from COVID fatigue. That's underselling what it means if you have school-age children, and you had schools that were open and closed in Connecticut. The governor pushed very hard to keep schools open. That opened up some tensions with very influential teachers unions in Connecticut. That's something he's still dealing with a little bit, but overall, he ended up well positioned. Obviously, there's been a backlash. There have been people pushing at his emergency powers, although personally, I think average voters focus more on the actual mandates and whatever restrictions in place. And right now, there aren't very many.
Well, and that's the flip side of the emergency powers, right? When you take over the state as he did, the legislature wasn't in session for this long period of time. He gets these extended emergency powers, which go and go and go. You get to do things the way you want to. But then if people don't like those things, you're the only face of it. And I think that has been a little bit of the backlash as well.
He owns it. He owns all of it. And that is the nature of the job. Certainly when it comes to presidents and governors on economic issues, it's sometimes, particularly with governors, they have very little to do with what's going well and what isn't going well. I don't think you can make a credible case that Ned Lamont is responsible for inflation in Connecticut. I think there's a little thing called the Federal Reserve Board, as well as a supply chain that has been under unusual stress for the better part of 2 years. But that's just the nature of the game. And he is the face of Connecticut government clearly at this point. Again, he has had more exposure for better or worse than you would normally get. But again, it has positioned him pretty well. There is a long history in Connecticut of Connecticut voters standing by incumbents when they seek re-election for governor. The last time an incumbent governor was denied re-election was in 1954, the year Ned Lamont was born. That was when Abe Ribicoff defeated John Lodge. So that certainly shows, a pretty long history in Connecticut. That doesn't mean that can't be overcome, because gubernatorial elections in Connecticut tend to be competitive.
But before we get to his challenges and some of the splits, the interesting splits within the Republican Party, you had mentioned before the Black and Puerto Rican caucus. other more progressive members of the Democratic Party. Is there, in your mind at this point with this governor, a real palpable split between the way he has chosen to govern during COVID, the way he has chosen to expend federal dollars towards certain things, the way he may approach a year in which he's running for reelection, he's got surpluses, but he doesn't want to raise taxes on anyone? Are there splits between him and more progressive parts of the party?
There are. The question is, what will they do about it? Now, I think some of the tensions will go away when they do resolve how to spend the federal American Rescue Plan money. That is one of the things that Jerry Reyes, who is the leader of the Black and Puerto Rican caucus, said is causing some friction between his caucus and the governor. The governor recognized that. In fact, for his political director, he has hired Brandon McGee, a former leader of the Black and Puerto Rican caucus, to be the political director of his campaign. Now, that by itself is not going to change things, but it does give the governor a member of his campaign staff who certainly can communicate easily with that caucus, but it's going to be delivering substance, not just having a familiar face taking their calls. So I think that can be resolved. More difficult will be people who would really like to see a more progressive tax structure, particularly on upper income households. The governor has been pretty clear. He supports progressive taxes, but he would like to see it in the federal level. Because like the governor before him, Dan Malloy, he is very mindful of Connecticut's ability to compete with other states. That competition involves, I think, reality as well as perception. You know, there's been a lot of research about what will drive the wealthy away. And most research indicates it's a whole, there's a whole matrix of things before people get up and leave. But Connecticut, it's a high cost state, but it's a bargain next to New York State. Real estate is expensive in Connecticut, cheaper than over the line in Westchester.
Cheaper than an awful lot of other places in the country, to be sure. So his challengers this time, we were thinking maybe a couple days ago, a couple weeks ago, that they could include Themis Klarides, the former Republican leader, and Bob Stefanowski, who Ned Lamont beat last time. And now, as of today, it seems clear that it's probably just Bob Stefanowski. So tell us about Bob. Mark, he never went away. He kept running. He has officially rebooted this campaign for governor once again. Is there anything different about Bob Stefanowski this time around? I mean, last time it was pretty much about just that one issue, tolls. Is there more on the bone there this time?
Well, how soon you forget. It was the income tax. He was going to make the income tax go away. That was the central issue his first time out. He really made his debut. He'd been a candidate for some months, but he really had his debut in December, January, 4 years ago with Arthur Laffer, the creator of the Laffer curve. And he came out as a real strong supply sider. And his call was, if we could eliminate the income tax that was created in 1991, that Connecticut's economy would take off. Now, he had several problems. The income tax is responsible for a hell of a lot of money in Connecticut. And he never explained, even if you accepted the premise, which many economists don't, but if you accepted the premise,
yes,
that would cause the economy in Connecticut to take off. The question was, how would Connecticut collect revenue? He did not want to say, well, we would go back to the 1991 sales tax rate, which was 8%, and very high tax rates on investment income, as high as 14%, as well as higher corporate taxes. So that was something he struggled with his entire campaign 4 years ago. There were people who thought that was sort of intellectually disingenuous, although he did say in his defense that it was aspirational, and he wasn't suggesting you could do it all at once. But this time, his reboot is he is staying away from that kind of promise. And he's really trying, I think, tap into the current political zeitgeist, which is people are concerned about inflation in a way that they haven't been since Ronald Reagan unseated Jimmy Carter as president in 1980. And so that is what Bob Stefanowski talked about when he kicked off his campaign last month. And he is kind of like small ball, right? He's talking about what can we do immediately to make it easier on people to fill their tank with gas, to get to work and to buy groceries.
Understanding that the Connecticut governor's office is not one that tends to, as you suggested earlier, have much sway over inflation.
No, but you do have control over fuel taxes, and fuel taxes tend to ripple through the economy. That's one argument. You do have control over the sales tax. Now, even though Connecticut is sitting on a pretty good surplus, there's not much you can do with a broad-based sales tax, and Mr. Stefanowski has not been terribly specific at this point as to how he would do that. Now, one of the great advantages of being a challenger as opposed to being the sitting governor, the governor on February 9th, when he talks about cutting taxes, the numbers are going to have to work.
Yes.
He's going to have a full plan. If you are the challenger, you can talk about cutting all kinds of things because there's no test until the election day in November, or if you win your first budget, the following January or February.
So what about Themis Klarides, who we were expecting when she decided that she was going to sort of dip her toe into a statewide race, that it would be for governor? What do you make, before we talk about her challenging Dick Blumenthal, as you've reported today, what do we make about her stepping out of this race?
Themis Klarides had, I think, what was going to be an insurmountable problem if she had continued running for governor. She is married to the executive vice president and general counsel of Eversource. And that's a problem in two ways. It's a state regulated utility. The governor of Connecticut is the appointing authority for the utility regulators. But beyond that, there is a real big problem with the optics, because utilities tend to anger people. Connecticut is electricity is expensive. If
it's not always on.
It's not, well, and that's just it. If, during the Isaias, Eversource was criticized and eventually fined for what was deemed to be insufficient preparations. They did not have enough crews in place based on the forecast. Our lights on, and it turned out they weren't needed. So however it goes, a governor is in the position to either praise Eversource or critique Eversource. And if you're married to a senior executive at Eversource, whichever way you go, it's going to be suspect. So that was one problem, and I don't know how she's going to get around it. There was speculation that perhaps Bob Stefanowski and Themis Klarides could do what Ned Lamont and Susan Weisswitz did 4 years ago. They made a compact. They created a ticket, and it worked very well for Ned Lamont and Susan Weisswitz. But there was certainly friction between the two of them, and that was quite clear. And it was quite clear Sunday when Klarides announced that she indeed was going for U.S. Senate instead, because even though Stefanowski is sort of the only credible candidate left, she was very cool about endorsing him. She just said, well, whoever the eventual nominee is, I will certainly endorse.
Well, I mean, that coolness notwithstanding, I think that the announcements, including that you reported today coming out of state Republican headquarters, at least seem to suggest, okay, the good thing about this for Republicans is we now basically know what's going to happen. We're not going to have this big fight. We're not going to be slinging mud at each other all the way up through August, getting ready to try to beat Ned Lamont. We probably know now that it's Bob Stefanowski. Seems as though the state party is going to rally behind him.
Which will be very unusual. Unless they have had an incumbent governor, the Republicans have a hard time avoiding primaries. The last election without a gubernatorial primary was when Jody Rell was the sitting governor. And of course, nobody challenged her in 2006. She was incredibly popular and won handily. So that would be of incredible benefit for Bob Stefanowski if he can avoid spending, $4 or $5 million or more on a primary. He seems to be leaning towards self-funding. He promised, he said he put $10 million in his campaign account, and he's committed $1 million to television buys already. We don't know exactly how wealthy Bob Stefanowski is. We know he is not as wealthy as Ned Lamont. Ned Lamont is clearly able to spend $10, $15, $20 million on a race. He has before. And that was to me, one of the funnier angles for Bob's kickoff. You had the wealthy Bob Stefanowski saying the wealthier Ned Lamont is out of touch with the middle class.
It's interesting. I want to move on this in a second to Themis Claridis taking on Dick Blumenthal and what that means for the Republican Party. But just before we get off of this issue of how much money is going to be spent, we just had a question here from it's Evalise, I believe, who says, if anyone remembers the Roland Curry election, it happened on my 9th birthday. That's 1994. You'll appreciate that, Paz. That entire season had the worst mudslinging I've ever seen, Evalise says. And I guess I'm wondering what sort of a preview you may have for this upcoming year. I mean, there's a lot going on with this. Yes, there is a lot of mud that can be slung. Yes, there is a lot of money that can be spent. There also seems to be increasingly a weariness and a wariness amongst Americans about political mudslinging. And I guess I'm just wondering what you think that's going to look like, what that campaign against those two gentlemen, if that's what happens, looks like this year.
Everybody says that they are tired of negative campaigning, but over and over again, it proves to be pretty effective if it's done a certain way. And yes, in 1994, Curry-Rowland was an ugly campaign, as was their second go in 2002. But Bob Stefanowski has indicated he is going to make accountability and integrity an issue. He has been very critical of the contract that the Lamont administration gave to a company called Semaphore. Now, at the time, the state was desperate for testing capacity for COVID. And there were 4 companies who had FDA approved testing capacity, and the state gave contracts to all 4 of them. Now, one of those companies, a company called Semaphore, and don't worry, I'm going to give the short version of this. The governor's wife, Annie Lamont, her venture capital firm is one of the investors in Semaphore. So, the shorthand version has been Annie Lamont and Ned Lamont profited from that contract. Well, that's a very complex calculation to do, how one investor, including a very significant investor, and how a partner in that investment firm can profit from a particular contract. So I'm sure we were going to hear about that. Stefanowski's going to say Lamont was basically, if not dishonest, but at least careless about ethics and about the appearance of a conflict. Lamont did get clearance from the Office of State Ethics. There were certain steps taken. And again, this is it's a complex question. People said, he profited from the contract. I've done something of a deep dive there, and just trust me, it's hard to divine precisely what a particular investor made off of a particular contract that was let to a company in which you were invested in. Be that as it may, that we're going to hear about that. Now, will we hear and see a rerun of the criticism and the questions about Bob Stefanowski? His last job in global finance was as the chief executive officer of a company whose product is illegal to offer in the state of Connecticut. That is Dollar Financial, and they are a payday loan company. Now, Stefanowski's time as CEO there was interesting, and I'll be revisiting that. But he did make certain reforms. But the bottom line is, even with the changes he made in that company and the improved products they put together, they still violated Connecticut law, and that's something he's going to hear about again. So we'll see how hard they go at each other over those things, as opposed to looking at actual policy decisions about tax policy, about how Bob Stefanowski would have managed the pandemic differently than Ned Lamont did.
So moving now to the news of today that we've referenced already, Themis Klarides stepping aside, saying she's going to run against Richard Blumenthal in his bid once again for re-election. Themis Klarides does a couple things for Republicans here. She gives Republicans a high-profile statewide candidate that they don't necessarily always have in these Senate races. To be fair, they don't necessarily have in any of the 5 congressional races. There are some exceptions, and there have been some close races over the course of the last few decades. But all in all, Paz, Republicans have not fielded incredibly attractive statewide or federal candidates. Is Themis Klarides a change for them for the better, from their perspective?
She might be. And so the story that I wrote today, it was about Themis. It was surprising how unprepared she was to capitalize on really the splash she made Sunday on WTNH when she announced that she was switching from the governor's race to U.S. Senate. You get one chance to launch a campaign. You get attention, you tend to dominate a news cycle, and you want to be ready. You want to be ready with a fundraising apparatus. You want to be ready for a web page. And as I reported a few hours ago, Themis Klarides is not yet a legal candidate for the United States Senate. She is yet to create a campaign committee. She has no website. She has no fundraising capacity. And so, quite frankly, she has blown an opportunity to make a splash and capitalize on the attention she got Sunday. Laura Ingraham, who is from Connecticut, the Fox News host, she gave a very nice shout out to Themis Klarides, to her 3.8 million followers on Twitter. And Klarides could not capitalize on it. So, that was starting, with a big gaffe. She's up against one of the more formidable politicians in Connecticut. Now, the flip side of that is, if you're trying to raise money among conservatives across the country, Blumenthal is, because he is an iconic liberal senator who has been attacked many times by Donald Trump in a very personal manner. Dick Blumenthal is he's a good fundraising tool if you're trying to appeal to conservatives, and that is something that could help her draw close to Blumenthal's fundraising. Blumenthal started January with $7.5 million in the bank, and So Themis Claridis or Leora Levy, who's a Republican National Committee member, a woman of some wealth. She is a very successful fundraiser for the Republicans, so successful she was rewarded by Donald Trump with a nomination as ambassador of Chile. That was kind of late in the game, so the US Senate never got around to a confirmation vote. But I was just talking to one of the consultants who is helping Levy at this point, and that person indicated that she is not scared off by Themis Claridis jumping into the race on Sunday. And if she gets in, you have somebody who's on good terms with Donald Trump. So does that bring Donald Trump into a Republican primary in Connecticut for US Senate? If that happens, that injects an element that a lot of Republicans would just as soon hope would stay away.
They would hope maybe would stay away, but the fact of the matter is that Themis Claridis, if she's getting tweets from Fox News hosts, or she's getting campaign contributions from somewhere in Idaho because someone can't stand Dick Blumenthal, in one way or another, she's got to answer questions about Donald Trump, who is at this point, obviously, angling once again to be president and has this entire apparatus behind him. Knowing what we know about Connecticut Republicans, but also just people in Connecticut in general, we saw the impact in the state legislature of Donald Trump. Republicans lost seats. Republicans and Donald Trump don't exactly mix in Connecticut, but if you're running a national campaign, as she would have to, you have to do something that appeals to Trump people. That seems like a kind of a bad mix for somebody like Themis Claridis.
So Themis Claridis was a Trump delegate in 2016, but she was not particularly out front about it. The entire delegation was committed to Trump, who handily won the Connecticut Republican primary in April of 2016. So the fact she was a Trump delegate by itself does not signal a lot. But yes, Trump's insistence that the election was stolen, this is what has continued to be a difficult issue for people like Claridis and even Bob Stefanowski. Claridis has been consistent going back a year ago. Her position was President Trump had every right to pursue every legal avenue. He did. He did not overturn any election results, and it was time to move on. And that was Themis Claridis' position in January of last year, not this year. This year, her position is similar, which is let's embrace reality. Joe Biden is the constitutionally elected president of the United States, but she's doing so in a way that does not insult the Republican base, at least not overtly. And that's going to be the challenge if Leora Levy essentially invites Donald Trump into this race, because then the former president is going to insist that people say, well, do you agree with me? Am I the victim of voter fraud? Bob Stefanowski a year ago dodged that question. This year, he answered it very forthrightly. He does not believe there was fraud to a degree that changed the results of the presidential election, and that he does not question the legitimacy of Joe Biden as president. That may not be a startling position to most of the people on this conference, but it does carry some risk with Republican primary voters. The polling is very clear that the majority of Republicans think that fraud tainted Joe Biden's election in 2020.
So, and then a last thing on this, Joe Biden's election in 2020 has led to a Joe Biden who a year into his presidency is at about 41% approval rating. He is not viewed by most Americans, including many Democrats, as being able to handle the economy currently, to handle the pandemic currently. There are certainly some weaknesses that Joe Biden has shown. What does that mean for Democrats all up and down the political spectrum as they look toward election or re-election this year, Paz. The fact is, it's much easier to go into a midterm election on the coattails of a president who's performing well, as opposed to one who is perceived to be flagging.
Well, one of the strongest trends in American politics goes back to the 1930s, and that is the party that holds the White House loses seats in Congress. And Democrats cannot afford to lose many seats since they only have a 5-vote majority in the House, and it's 50-50 in the Senate. They control it by virtue of the Vice President of the United States being the presiding officer in the tie-breaking vote. So in Connecticut, midterms, we certainly saw a huge impact in 2018. There was a very strong reaction to Donald Trump. The Democrats were energized, and 2018, believe it or not, in blue Connecticut was the first time since 2008, the big Obama year, that Democrats picked up seats in the General Assembly. Connecticut's a weird state in that the National Republican brand has killed the Republicans in Connecticut as far as running for US Senate and Congress. At least that's been the history in the United States Senate, for 40 years. They have not won a congressional race since Chris Shays was the last man standing. He lost in 2008. So it's, the midterm elections, usually don't swing General Assembly races to a great degree. That was unusual in 2018. But the Democrats are nervous. We saw it during the machinations over the reapportionment, the redistricting of the congressional districts. You had people in what I think are pretty clearly safe Democratic seats who were fighting over, a few blocks, moving a line here and there. Rosa DeLauro, was pushing very hard not to accept certain changes. In the end, what is at least before the Supreme Court right now, the recommendation of the special master is keeping a map that's, pretty much the same that we've had for 20 years. That map has produced nothing but Democratic victories since 2006. But 2 of the districts are competitive. And in one of those 2 districts, the 5th district, there is a Republican candidate who shows some signs of being able to raise money. It's a long way, between now and November. But the 5th district of Connecticut, at least on paper, is a competitive district. It's a lean Democratic district, but that is a district that Bob Stefanowski, for example, carried in 2018 when he ran for governor. He also carried Eastern Connecticut, 2nd district. So that says, those districts are potentially competitive. Right now, I don't think Joe Courtney is terribly worried in the 2nd district, given that the Republican running against him actually spent more money on his campaign than he raised in the last quarter, and he's got less than $100,000 in the bank. That does not bode well for the Republicans in the 2nd district. But in the 5th district, if they catch a few breaks, that could make a difference. And again, given that Republicans only need to pick up 5 seats in Congress, they're going to look anywhere where they think money can make a difference.
We're going to take just a quick break. And when we come back, we're going to get some of the questions that you have. A lot of you have questions about what this is going to mean for policy at the state capitol. We're talking about this big political year with Mark Pazniokas. He's the Capitol Bureau Chief of the Connecticut Mirror. I'm John Dankosky. And now, as they say in radio, a word from our sponsors.
Rebuilding Connecticut following the COVID pandemic is a challenge unlike any we've ever faced before. State tax hikes and unchecked government spending have proven to impede our recovery. They don't make our state more affordable. They chase away our businesses, good-paying jobs, and our people. The good news is we can rebuild our economy and get our people back to work. But it's going to take a different approach and different thinking. Our businesses were essential when our communities needed them most. And now it's our turn. Every business, worker, friend, neighbor is essential to recovering our economy better, stronger, and more prosperous than before. Ask your local leaders to stand with you and your local businesses. Sign the Rebuild Connecticut Pledge at rebuildct.com.
I want to thank Chris and everybody at CBIA for being our sponsors for this event series. And as we've said, we do have a few more events coming up this Thursday and next Tuesday. You can find out more at ctmirror.org. Okay, Paz, Rosalind asks us, can we expect any more legislation on climate change above Lamont's December 2021 order? If so, any expectation that anything will pass in this short session? Any thoughts about climate change or some of the other big issues that I know people who are on this call are interested in?
No, the governor seems to be pretty well chastened by the idea of doing anything that can either raise the price of gasoline or is perceived as raising the price of gasoline. We had a great semantical debate for a year about whether TCI, the Transportation Climate Initiative, would result in a gasoline tax. In an election year, in a short session, I would be very surprised to see anything done substantively. I think that's going to require, quite frankly, a second Ned Lamont term, and Democrats in the legislature not being quite as frightened on the idea of doing something that affects the price of gasoline or electricity. That, of course, has been a fundamental, tension in what we do about climate change. We've seemed to have turned a corner on the electrical part of it. We do have significant renewables that are at least in the pipeline, although pipeline's a bad term for renewables. It's in the wind. I can feel it in the wind. So you do have those kind of changes in the transmission of electricity where renewables are becoming more competitive with natural gas, which is Connecticut's kind of transition fuel. That's how it's been described. Of course, the governor did act pretty decisively to make sure that Millstone was stabilized. There was some controversy over that. Was that a gift to Millstone? But Millstone obviously is still the single largest source of carbon-free electricity in the state. And one of the largest in the region.
Ramon asks, what's going on with criminal justice reforms this session, especially the PROTECT Act, which was vetoed after it was passed in both the House and Senate?
There's going to be, it's going to be difficult to do anything substantively on that. So there's going to be, there already are indications that the Republicans are going to try to make crime a significant issue, that there is pushback to the police accountability law that was passed after the Floyd killing. Republicans point to fewer traffic stops. It's become more difficult to recruit police officers. But I have yet to see evidence that is different in Connecticut, which has a police accountability bill, as opposed to other states where it's just generally, it's been harder and harder to recruit police officers. It's a tough business. It's always been a tough business. And it's become even more so, in the post-Floyd era. So the PROTECT Act, that may be difficult to do this year. Again, I think the election is going to clarify what direction a number of things take in 2023. But 3 months is going to go by fast, and a lot of it's going to be, again, fighting over money, what taxes are cut, and how the ARPA money is eventually spent. But there's always a surprise or two. So I will be a weasel and hedge that way. There's always a chance.
Patricia is asking about early voting and whether or not it's going to become an issue in the governor's race. I mean, you talked earlier about Bob Stefanowski saying definitively, look, there was not fraud in the race for president enough to overturn the election of Joe Biden. That having been said, if he's running as the Republican nominee for governor if the issue comes up about how do we vote in Connecticut? Do we make it easier for more people to vote, or do we clamp down and make it harder for people to vote? Is that something that's going to come up, do you think, in this legislative session, or going to come
No.
up in the governor's race?
It doesn't have to come up legislative session because it has come up, and there's going to be a constitutional amendment. There will be a referendum. So early voting is the less controversial of the two big questions that have been on the table in Connecticut. One is early voting, and the other one is no excuse absentee ballots. Connecticut is unusual in that the state constitution really limits what the legislature can do. So there will be an early voting question on the ballot. It won't create early voting. If passed, it would allow the legislature within certain parameters to do so. But again, that would not happen this year. No excuse absentee balloting, or at least more flexible, that would require to get on to create a constitutional amendment referendum is two ways. One, you could have a supermajority in 1 year, and that goes on. That failed, but it did not get a supermajority. The other way is in successive legislatures, it must pass by a majority. So it's passed in one legislature, it needs to pass by another legislature after the 2022 election. And then Connecticut voters would get a shot at that in 2024. They couldn't change the law until 2026. So if you're looking for no excuse absentee ballots, put it on your calendar for 2026 as a possibility. Now, doesn't mean, Bob Stefanowski and Ned Lamont won't express their opinions. I think Lamont's been pretty clear. He's in favor of both. Mr. Stefanowski, I think, like many Republicans, is open to early voting under certain circumstances, but anything having to do with absentee ballots seems to be a red flag for Republicans right now.
This is the sort of question that I know we're going to put to Keith Fanoff on Thursday, but Diane is asking, what should happen with the rainy day fund? Should we protect it and pay off pension and healthcare debt? What do we do with the fact that we've got, more money than governors usually have to play with? Well,
and as a result of a law passed in 2017, it was a bipartisan law that there's a volatility cap, and it does require certain amount of a budget reserve to go to exactly that purpose. And I believe it was $1.6 billion actually out of the last surplus went to pay down the unfunded pension liability. So yeah, that is in place. I don't see that certainly changing. And that is sort of a check and balance on this legislature in a time when there's surplus funds.
Michelle is asking the question, will the January 6th committee findings influence Connecticut politics to a significant extent or any extent?
Well, I'll go back to what I said earlier. If Donald Trump is a presence, either physically or just by making statements for or against somebody in a Republican primary, I think that will make January 6th an issue. It will make, more broadly than January 6th, is the fact that a former president has insisted his successor was not legitimately elected. We have never seen that. That is unusual. That is not a topic that a lot of Republican office holders really want to debate again. Now, I will say that there are at least 3 Republicans running for Secretary of State. One of them has made voter fraud an issue, but I'll tell you, all 3 have stayed away from former President Trump's insistence that the election was stolen. None of them are with him on that. And, most of the Republicans I've interviewed on that, though, even the ones who believe voter fraud is a serious issue, they do not see it as something that is capable of tilting a presidential election. You know, I think the strongest statements you see are that Connecticut should be more diligent about making sure its voter rolls are cleaned up. You know, there is a pending case in Stamford of a former Democratic chair who is charged criminally, basically with stealing absentee ballots. And it was discovered. Now, the people who are involved in elections enforcement say, you know what, the system worked. The guy was caught, whether he was guilty of theft or not. But the fact that there were ballots fraudulently obtained by whomever, and it was caught. There are checks and balances. It's funny. One of the, you know, a story I wrote in November of last year was actually, I'm sorry, November of 2020.
It's hard to tell these days, isn't it?
Really, I mean, God,
it just all runs together.
I haven't left this room in 2 years. I don't know why I'm wearing a sport coat. But, you know, I wrote a story that said voter fraud is real. It's just not to the extent that Donald Trump thinks it is. And that became a story that had a long shelf life for us. It was, you know, 100,000 people all over the country that, you know, because every time if you Googled, is voter fraud real? Yeah. That story would come up first. So, but I think some of the Trump people were disappointed to see my finding in that respect.
Because you mentioned the Secretary of State's race, somebody had been asking about under-ticket races. Is there anything interesting at all to look at in any of the statewide races, or anything happening that you think is interesting that we haven't talked about yet? We mentioned, for instance, the 5th Congressional District. You just mentioned the Secretary of State's race. Is there anything that you think people should be watching out for this political year that we haven't talked about yet?
Well, the Republicans right now don't have candidates yet for lieutenant governor, for controller, for attorney general, and treasurer, I believe. I may be wrong on one of those, but I do know that I talked to Ben Proto again today, the Republican state chair, and he said, you know, he's confident they will have credible candidates in all 5 congressional districts as well as the entire under-ticket. But one of the things that is different this time, you know, Connecticut has kind of a two-headed approach to lieutenant governor. When it comes to seeking a party nomination, you run separately from the office of governor. But once you win the nomination, the voters cast one vote for governor and lieutenant governor. So, you know, we have had some shotgun marriages, certainly on the Republican side. 4 years ago, Bob Stefanowski did not pick a running mate. Senator Joe Markley won a 3-way primary, and you know, he ended up as the running mate. So it's unclear if Stefanowski will try to pick a running mate and avoid a primary. If you're going to avoid a primary for governor, can you avoid one for lieutenant governor? So, you know, I don't know on the under-tickets, there's nothing that jumps out yet. You have 2 open seats, Secretary of State, and that's the one that's drawing attention. And then you have controller. And it's not, you know, drawing a lot of attention, except on the Democratic side. Representative Sean Scanlon is currently running an exploratory campaign looking at that office.
So, Paz, next Wednesday, when the legislative session kicks off, how do you think about your coverage in this year? We've talked about, you know, we started by talking about your unified theory of all this around politics and the role it plays, especially in an election year. But I guess I'm just wondering how you think about coverage of a state legislative session in a year in which politics is just going to be pressing down on everything.
Well, you look at things through a political lens, but you also have to acknowledge when somebody is making a significant policy suggestion, regardless of the political benefit. You know, I had a story last week when the Senate Republicans outlined what they would like to see happen on mental health policy. Now, it did not appear to be anything that wasn't already under consideration. But it was interesting. The Democratic co-chair of the Public Health Committee, rather than kind of mock it, saying, well, there's really nothing new here, he embraced it. He said, this is great. This increases the possibility that we can have perhaps bipartisan action on some public health bills. They won't be huge, but there's a chance it'll be a bipartisan support for expanding telemedicine, telehealth, what was allowed during the pandemic. But insurers have been kind of wary about, covering that. They're looking at, again, these are not earth-shattering things, but right now, there's certainly a staff shortage in mental health providers, particularly for children. One of the suggestions is right now you must be a licensed clinical social worker to have your services covered by Husky, which is the Medicaid program in Connecticut for children. There are some private insurers who will reimburse coverage for somebody who is a master's degree in social work, but is not yet licensed, as long as they're under. I mean, again, this is not something that's going to change the world, but I think there are a bunch of things like that that could be important to some people. And you may see bipartisan agreement on those things, even in this very political year.
What a hopeful note to end on. Look at you.
Right.
Let's see if Keith Phaneuf can be that hopeful when I talk to him on Thursday.
Good luck with that.
Good luck with that. I want to thank Mark Pazniokas. He's the Capitol Bureau Chief, celebrating 40 years of covering politics this year. Man, Paz, that's a long time. Thanks so much for the
I'm
extra
marking
hour.
40 years. I don't know that I'm celebrating them quite yet, but thank you for the sentiment.
I'm celebrating at least the 20 some of those years we've been talking together about politics. I want to thank you for joining us tonight. As I said before, Keith Phaneuf joins us. Hey, look, my cat's in the background. Keith Phaneuf joins us on Thursday at this time, 7 o'clock to 8 o'clock. We're going to be taking your questions and doing something big on the budget. Next Tuesday, we have I don't know, it's like a legislative preview panel. It's sort of like, I don't know, a radio show I used to do. We got some great guests and we're going to talk about some of the big issues next Tuesday at 7 o'clock. If you'd like to support not just programs like this, silly programs like this, but all of the great reporting that Paz and all of his colleagues do at the Connecticut Mirror on the fancy new Connecticut Mirror website, and it really is cool if you haven't checked it out very much, go clicking around and see how this site has changed. Go to ctmirror.org. You can look at it, but you can also click on the donate button to help support it. I want to thank Kyle Constable, who produces these things for us, our publisher, Bruce Putterman, Beth Hamilton, of course, the editor of the Connecticut Mirror. I want to thank our sponsor, CBIA. I'm John Dankosky. I'll see many of you again on Thursday. Please have a safe and healthy week.